Hello! Welcome to this 12th episode of the Shift English podcast. We are entering into the Christmas season here in the USA, which means we are being bombarded with the same music in the supermarkets over and over. When we say someone is getting bombarded by something, it is usually in a slightly negative way to mean they are receiving a lot of something. Like someone getting bombarded with questions is someone getting asked a lot of questions. But yes, during Christmas time, the shops here are only allowed to play the same 5 songs on repeat. And after the 1000th time of hearing the same song, you are ready for Christmas to be over. I am sounding like a Christmas hater, a person that really does not like Christmas, but that's a total lie. I am really a fan of Christmas. I am really someone that likes Christmas a lot. And one of the reasons I like Christmas, and more generally the winter season, is because I seem to do a lot more reading. And not too long ago, I was reading a really good book called A Marriage at Sea by author Sophie Elmhirst. It's the story of Maurice and Maralyn Bailey, an ordinary British couple who survived for 117 days on a tiny life raft in the Pacific Ocean after their boat sank. And instead of the usual type of episode today, I wanted to talk about their story a little because I find it an inspiring and moving story, and partly because, perhaps strangely, I am both someone that is passionate about sailing and someone who is passionate about shipwrecks, about stories of people surviving after their boat was destroyed. Not sure if it is necessarily healthy to be both a sailor and to be interested by shipwrecks. It is kind of like a pilot that likes reading about plane crashes. I'll talk to my therapist about it. But my therapist isn't here, and I want to explore their journey with you, what they faced out there on the water, and what their experience says about the way we prepare, the way we cope, and the way we love. So, when you're ready, climb into the life raft with me and let's set sail. So, this book I referenced by Sophie Elmhirst is a non-fiction book. The story of Maurice and Maralyn is a real story. They really did live the things described in the book. And what the author does a good job of doing is using her skills as a journalist to find out all the little facts behind the story, to make their story feel very personal. It's not just factual. It feels human. Very quick side note, not related to this topic really, but I got asked the other day what job title in English have male and female equivalents. For example, policeman, policewoman, or actor, actress. And that made me wonder about the job title author, because in English, it doesn't matter if it is a man or a woman that wrote something. We just say they are an author. But because I am a geek, I like to know the details. So I researched it, and in English, we used to call female authors by the title authoress, apparently. Now, that word isn't used at all, and it would be sexist to use it. It would be seen as inappropriate to make the distinction. And I learned that even titles that are used in common speech, like policeman, policewoman, or actor, actress, are all being replaced now in modern English by gender-neutral equivalents. For example, we would say police officers, or we would say actors, even if it was a woman. Anyway, an interesting side note, especially for English learning, but doesn't have much to do with our story, so let me get back to that. What I like about the story of Maurice and Maralyn, about them personally, I mean, is that they are ordinary people. Their story takes place in the early 1970s. They had normal jobs, a normal house, and a normal routine. But after years of the same daily rhythm, they felt a quiet sense that life was passing by too quickly, that there wasn't enough vitality in their lives, meaning they didn't feel fully alive or satisfied, and that maybe they were meant for something more. So they made a bold decision. They made a courageous decision. They sold almost everything they owned, bought a small sailing boat, and set out to find a new kind of life. Not a richer life, not a more successful life, but a more meaningful one. Their desire to break away from routine and choose a life that feels alive, I think that is something a lot of us can still relate to, even 50 years after their story. And initially, at first, everything went well. The weather was calm, the days were peaceful, not crazy storms or anything. It was just the two of them together on board their sailboat. They sailed from England, where they were from, across the coast of Europe, and then hopped over to the Canary Islands. From there, they crossed over the Atlantic Ocean to the Caribbean Islands. I've never sailed this route personally, maybe because I am too chicken to cross over a wide ocean, meaning I am too scared to cross over a wide ocean. But the route they took is a pretty standard way to cross the ocean. It makes use of a famous wind system known as the trade winds that blow steadily during a certain season from east to west. Because if you don't have enough wind when you are sailing, you may find yourself in what we call the doldrums, which is a word I love and that has both a literal and figurative sense. Literally, the doldrums is when you are stuck for usually several days at least, not really going anywhere because you don't have the wind to move you along. And in the figurative sense, like I am in the doldrums, means that you are stuck in your life, not really going anywhere. Anyway, you know I can't help getting distracted by the words I like in English, but back to our story. After this first part of their voyage to the Caribbean and through the Panama Canal, they started on the next part of their trip toward the Galápagos Islands, one of the important big milestones of their journey. Maurice took great satisfaction in this smooth beginning. He was a meticulous planner, the kind of person who double checks every rope, counts every tin of food, and studies the charts again just to be sure. He had spent months preparing the boat and imagining every small problem they might face. And in those early days, it felt like all his preparation was working. The journey seemed organized, almost comfortable, and the ocean felt safely predictable. But all of that changed later, far from land, when something arrived that no amount of planning could prevent. A sudden, violent encounter that would turn their peaceful voyage toward the Galápagos into a fight for survival. No matter how much you prepare, there are some things in life you simply cannot control. And for Maurice and Maralyn, that moment arrived on a quiet March morning in 1973, far out in the Pacific Ocean on their way to the Galápagos Islands. It was a quiet morning just after sunrise. Maralyn had gone inside the boat to wake up Maurice so he could take over from her. The ocean was calm, the sun was shining, everything was in order. Then, without warning, something enormous rose from below the boat. A sperm whale, a huge heavy body of muscle, hit the bottom of their sailboat with incredible force, putting a hole in the boat. Within seconds, water began rushing into the boat. No chance to save the boat. It was sinking. They grabbed what they could, a few tins of food, a knife, and climbed into the inflatable life raft. Then they watched their boat disappear under the water. And rather interestingly, a bit surreal even, Maralyn took a photo of her husband Maurice and the boat sinking. This photo was in the book too. This is part of the story that stays in my mind. The fact that despite how cautious Maurice was, despite how much preparation he took on every last detail, to the point he comes across as what we call a control freak in English, someone that tries to control everything to avoid any risk. Despite all of this, trying to predict all the dangers and prepare so as to avoid them, there was nothing he could do to predict the chance of a whale hitting their boat that morning. It was such an unlikely thing to happen, given how small a boat is and how big the ocean is. What are the chances a whale would surface right where their boat was? The couple, in fact, were convinced that it wasn't an accident at all. They believe that this whale actually targeted their boat. They believe the whale had been injured by another boat using a harpoon, a type of spear used to hunt whales, and that in revenge, this injured whale had deliberately decided to hit their boat. Regardless of why the whale hit their boat, the result was the same. They were now on a small inflatable boat, and their main boat had sunk to the bottom of the ocean, which was probably a little worrying to say the least. But given that the sea was calm, the weather was sunny, no problem, right? Just wait a few hours until the nearest Coast Guard helicopter, the nearest rescue helicopter, arrived. One small problem: they hadn't radioed for help. And why, might you ask? Why didn't they call for help? Because they didn't have time? Nope, not that the reason. They didn't radio for help because they didn't take a radio with them. Wait. You just said that Maurice was a control freak that was prepared for everything. How come then he didn't even have a radio on his sailboat? It was the 1970s. Radios weren't as sophisticated, as precise, but emergency radios did exist and were an option even then. So, what was the main reason? The main reason, at least in my opinion, after doing some research, is that Maurice was a purist. And on top of that, he underestimated the danger of the unexpected. What do I mean by this? Maurice liked doing things the pure or traditional way, without modern tools or shortcuts. He considered that he should be prepared enough and skillful enough that he shouldn't need to have a radio. In fact, he thought that if he took a radio, it might make him careless, because then he would start relying on technology instead of his own skills, what we could call a false sense of security. But Maurice, my dude, how are you going to prepare for a whale deciding to come whack your boat? And for me, lesson number 2 and possibly 3, being prepared is important, valuable, but we can't prepare for everything. And on top of that, being a purist is just fine if you are solo. Want to go sail off into the world's biggest ocean by yourself without a radio? No problem. Go for it. But I think the moment we decide to bring someone else along for the ride, at that point we are obligated to take the proper precautions. We should take along that emergency radio, even if we don't plan on using it ever. Because, we shouldn't make someone else have to take the risk. I prefer to split this story up for a couple reasons. Firstly, I am aware that I am talking more about Maurice than I am about Maralyn, and it's mainly because Maurice dominates the first part of the story. But after the couple are literally adrift without a boat, or at least without a regular sailboat, and without really a hope, it is Maralyn that becomes the most important person for me in the story. And I want to spend the time properly on her part of the story. Also, I enjoy the possibility about talking about their story for more than just this week. And in the same way that I think it is important people learn in a way that makes sense for their way of learning, I think the same is also true for creating. I want to be creating these episodes in a way that makes sense for me. So join me next week for the next part of their story and my own reflections. Remember to take a look over the handwritten transcript at shiftenglish.com. Until next week then, wishing you a wonderful week.